Science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, Tom Copenhaver, and Al Warren. 6.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. Michael Hawley is here.
Hello, Al.
Hey, you just barely made it.
Oh, yeah, it was a close call, but I got a substitute, so I got to be here.
Yeah, and what's this? Now, I keep seeing pictures of 6 feet of snow in Buffalo.
Oh, yeah, not anymore. Most of it's melted, but in the south towns of Buffalo, it was we got the lake effect, and people don't understand what lake effect is until they live near one of the Great Lakes, and it was truly 6 feet of snow over the weekend.
Yeah. But you don't stay cold there, so it goes away, doesn't it?
Right now, I think most of it's been melted. Yeah, we're around 40 degrees. We'll get to below freezing a little bit at the beginning of December. But yeah, it doesn't get as cold as like when you go in the center, like Minnesota or something. Right.
So it's the same around our lake here too, right? And you get it, and then it kind of melts off. So it's kind of good in a sense. And you've got your big truck, hey?
Oh yeah, my brand new truck. You betcha.
It's the big man truck.
Yep, I'm a truck owner now.
Yeah, truck owner. Okay, well, today we are going back, just like we were doing this last week and a couple other weeks. We cover, and you're good with this. You're Mr. Jack the Ripper. So.
Oh yes, I love it. I'm excited to talk to Richard.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking to a lifelong Sherlockian. And this time we have Mr. Richard T. Ryan. So welcome to the show, Richard.
Hey, Al. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Nice speaking with you.
Nice to you too, Michael.
Well, Richard, I always wonder where one begins this journey of being a lifelong Sherlockian. So this is from the get-go?
I actually discovered Sherlock Holmes and began to take him seriously when I was a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame. And I've delved into it. I've read the entire canon several times over, but it began at Notre Dame. And then back in the 80s, I wrote a Sherlock Holmes trivia book. And then I was getting ready to retire from the newspaper industry. I'd worked 30 years as a newspaper man, and I'd always wanted to write a book. And Sherlock Holmes just seemed like a natural.
What is it about Sherlock Holmes that is so fascinating to you, that keeps you involved in it for so many years?
Well, I think you have a character that's not a superhero. He's a normal, everyday individual, obviously a lot smarter than most people. And it's the creation and the way he uses his mental abilities and the partnership with Watson that are all endearing facets, of this character and his relationship with his best friend.
Do you like that the way that different places, television and movies and sometimes writers change who Sherlock Holmes is and even Watson?
Yeah, I'm not averse to it. It was one of my favorite TV shows was Elementary with, Johnny Lee Miller playing Holmes as a recovering drug addict, which he kind of is in the Doyle novels. Obviously, they took the liberty of turning Watson into a woman, which I'm fine with. There's a million different permutations of Sherlock Holmes. And my own gut feeling is, and the analogy I always use is like a coloring book. I don't care what colors you use, but I would like you to stay within the line.
Yeah.
So when they take Holmes to the extremes, that's something I'm not comfortable with. That's something I'm not fond of. But as long as it's a recognizable Holmes on the page and a recognizable Watson on the page. I mean, I'm fond of the Benedict Cumberbatch series. I have no problems with moving it up to contemporary times, you know. But there are certain, you know, if you're going to do Holmes, then do Holmes. Don't do your version of Holmes. Do Doyle's version of Holmes.
Yeah. Well, there's something about it. And the actual mystery in each book, the case that each one it covers, do you find it to be quite unique as far as mystery writing?
Well, Doyle was a master of style, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is, you know, all his novels. He wrote 4 novels, and they're all relatively short. 3 of them might even be considered novellas. The longest one is The Hound of the Basketball, is about 60,000 words. But I mean, he's got one that's 42,000 words, 43,000 words, 49,000 words. So I mean, they're short, and he does in 1 or 2 sentences what other authors need to take 1 or 2 paragraphs to do. You know, he was Hemingway before Hemingway knew how to write that way.
So what is that to you when you're in the position of being involved in writing, you know, Sherlock Holmes cases? Well,
the first book I wrote was called The Vatican Cameos, and what I did in that book, in 2 of the Sherlock Holmes novels, they're bipartite. The whole first half of the novel is Sherlock Holmes solving the mystery, and then the second half of the novel is the villain, if you will, giving us his backstory, and then Holmes comes in at the end for the denouement. What I did in the first book was I set all the odd chapters in the 1890s, 1901, I believe it was, and all the even chapters in 1501. You know, I had people saying, this is not a Holmes book, he's only in it for half the book. Well, yeah, but if you look at, you know, the sign of 4, he's only in it for half the book. If you look at it for A Study in Scarlet, he's only in it for half the book. But the thing that came out of that, where I was getting back to, was a very prominent Sherlockian whom I respect a great deal, liked the book, and he said, you know, it's similar to Doyle's in many respects. He says, the only thing is, if you're going to do Doyle, he says, you know, go with him in length as well. So the next 6 books I've written have all been rather short. They're in that Doylean range of 50 to 60,000 words. So, you know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I try to imitate Doyle in all aspects.
How does one become what you do? You know, like, is there like a certain test? Is there a certain procedure that you've got to go through before you write stories like Sherlock Holmes stories?
No, I think the thing you have to do, if you want to write a Sherlock Holmes story, because he is in public domain, and you certainly can use him as a character, but the thing is, you have to immerse yourself in what's called the canon, the 56 short stories and the 4 novels. You know, you have to basically know that cold, because Sherlockians are a very discerning audience, and they will call you out on even what they perceive to be the most minute slip. So half of the time I spend when I'm doing a book is spent in research, because the details all have to be right.
Richard, I wanted to be part of this because about a month and a half ago, I did a lecture, a local lecture. I researched Jack the Ripper, but I did a mutual lecture with our local Sherlock Holmes expert, Kevin Gallivan, and so his group, so we were speaking together, and the question was always, one question was why did Arthur Conan Doyle not have Sherlock Holmes go after Jack the Ripper? But the question was if he would have, all those kind of questions between, you know, the fictional person of Sherlock Holmes versus the nonfiction of Jack the Ripper. So I was curious about that, because what I was surprised at is that Arthur Conan Doyle did not have Sherlock Holmes kind of go against Jack the Ripper. Any thoughts on that?
As you can imagine, I've read several Holmes and Ripper encounters, for lack of a better word, and I'm starting to think, the more theories that we get about Jack the Ripper, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. There were a number of people that seem to think that in some way, somehow, the royal family was involved with the Jack the Ripper killings.
Yes.
And there was a book many years ago called Prince Jack that I have downstairs. But I'm almost wondering if Doyle just deliberately stayed away from it so as not to, A, bring any more attention to it than it had already attracted, and B, because somewhere, somehow, it might end up embarrassing, the Victoria and the royal family at that time.
Yeah, that could be. I did find when Arthur Conan Doyle was in Boston, and a reporter asked him in 1894 what would the Sherlock Holmes have done with Jack the Ripper, and so it was Arthur Conan Doyle that was convinced that Jack the Ripper was basically, they called him a monomaniac back at the time, but a person that had a disease, basically neurosyphilis. And then but he thought that the letters, some of the Ripper letters, that's what the Sherlock Holmes could have used possibly to help out. Sadly, most of those letters are actually fakes, but it's interesting because the guy I researched, the suspect is Francis Tumblety, he had the neurosyphilis. And Arthur Conan Doyle was making comments that the Dear Boss letter had Americanisms in it, so it was likely a monomaniac American, and that's exactly what Francis Tumblety was. So my argument at the end with Kevin was, if he would have known who Tumblety was at the time, maybe Sherlock Holmes would have battled Tumblety himself. So that was my fun part of it.
Are you familiar with Dr. H.H. Holmes?
Yes, and the problem with him was that he's a Chicago serial killer.
Right.
That his great grandson, when he Jeff Mudgett, when he looked at, he was researching to find out if Holmes was in Chicago during the Ripper killings in the autumn of 1888.
Right.
And he said he wasn't. So then his great-grandson said, therefore he was across the Atlantic and killed these women. But what happened is he forgot to look at the voting records. And, and he's in the voting records. And then also his daughter was born in July of 1889, which means that he had to have conceived during the middle of the Ripper murders in Chicago because his wife never left Chicago, unless it's not really his daughter. But so there's a lot of misconceptions when that came about. But,
No, I've seen his name, considered as a possibility for the Ripper, primarily, I guess, because he was a serial killer.
Right.
No one ever takes the time to, and then this is, again, when I go back to this, I go back to the details, If I were to do H.H. Holmes and consider him to be Jack the Ripper, believe me, I check the voting records.
Exactly. And then, but that's for sure. And also, the foremost expert in Holmes basically says there's absolutely no evidence that Holmes ever crossed the Atlantic. That's right. But so Sherlock Holmes has gone to America then.
He has.
That is cool.
Yeah, he went to Buffalo and joined an Irish secret society.
Oh, and I know that one because I'm in Buffalo, by the way.
Okay.
And I had to deal with these Irish societies because Tumblety was in Buffalo and he was an Irishman.
Right. And then he went back and became Altamont. That was his name in that story.
Oh, okay.
That was the one with Van Bork. And it's the one in one of the Rathbone movies. They take the scene. And they take the actual lines from the Doyle story, and Holmes says, "There's an east wind coming." And that's it's really well done. That particular story, I think, is really well done.
Did you ever wonder why Sherlock Holmes has such a lasting power with the public, like over and over and over? I mean, it seems like every decade we have new movies and new books and new versions, and it just it never seems to end.
It doesn't end, and it's I guess a testament to the skill of Doyle as an author. But as you point out, Robert Downey Jr. has done 2 movies. He's doing a third. We had the Cumberbatch series. We've had the Elementary series. Recent vintage, you have the Enola Holmes movies.
Right.
They're on Netflix, I believe.
And that's good.
Yeah, it's very good. There was a series on Netflix that was not so good called The Irregulars. But I mean, you go back and Holmes has either been on radio and TV almost constantly since like the 20s and the 30s. And not only in the English speaking, I mean, there was the whole Russian series. There's a Japanese series, Miss Holmes. I mean, I'm not sure why the appeal is as wide as it is, but there is definitely an appeal there. And people read Holmes and they find something that resonates with them.
Yeah, and it's generational too.
It is generational. And I think what a lot of people who like Holmes do, and I did this to a small degree myself, is they try to, interest their children in it. I wrote an alphabet book called B's for Baker Street. I have 2 small grandchildren. And the alphabet book is, geared, its own little rhymes, but hopefully, my granddaughter is going to be 4, my grandson was just 2. Hopefully when they get a little bit older, they can kind of read it, appreciate it, and understand, what Sherlock Holmes is about.
So you've written quite a few of these. So how do you choose what you're going to put together and how you're going to put together one of the stories?
There are 2 types of writers, I'm sure you know. There are plotters and there are pantsers.
Right.
And I'm a pantser. I sit down and I really have just a vague notion of what I'm going to write about. One of the novels that I wrote is called The Merchant of Menace. And at the heart of The Merchant of Menace is a Fabergé egg. And I had always had an abiding interest in Fabergé eggs. I was amazed by them. And that book allowed me to, delve into the history of Fabergé eggs, their construction, where they ended up, and everything else. And a lot of that found its way into my book. And it's just like something will strike me, and it could be the oddest thing, and that's what sets me off.
I find it fascinating. That's the whole concept. Now you've got this newest one out that it's called the Poison Pawn.
Correct.
And it's Sherlock Holmes Adventure, book number 14. So let's talk about that. So what's the premise of this?
I'm trying to hedge my bets here because I don't want to give away too much, obviously. The premise is that a young woman comes to Holmes and she says, my brother has disappeared. At the same time, Lestrade comes to Holmes and he says, we found a body in the London Bridge, which was under construction at that time. And it ends up, obviously her brother and the body are the same person. That comes on early in the book. But it develops into a 3-dimensional game of chess, if you will, between Holmes and his unknown adversary. And, at several points during the book, Watson tells Holmes, when you're playing chess, if you lose a pawn, you just take it off the board. You lose a piece. He goes, but you're playing with lives and you're playing with people's, destinies. And Holmes says, I'm well aware of that. So he never takes anything for granted. But it became a chess match because I've always enjoyed chess as well. That kind of grew into, 2 men literally trying to outwit each other.
Have you ever thought about where Sherlock Holmes came from with Doyle? Like what if he was after someone else, created under the image of another person?
Well, the general theory is that he was modeled on one of Doyle's medical school teachers, Dr. Joseph Bell. And they said, one of the things that Bell would do is he would have a beaker of really foul tasting liquid in front of the class. And he would put his finger in, he would dip his finger in and then taste it. And he'd say, okay, I want you all to do the same. And each of his students would come up and he'd say, they would do the same thing. But what Bell did was he put his index finger into the beaker, but he put his middle finger into his mouth to taste it. So he never actually tasted the stuff. And he would tell them, you see, but you do not observe, which is what Holmes is always preaching. We're not paying attention. You see someone stick a finger in a thing of liquid, put it in their mouth, you assume that's the finger that went into the liquid without even thinking about it. So he appears to be the model for Sherlock Holmes.
His antagonist, Professor Moriarty.
Right.
Have you ever used him, or you've shy away from him?
I've used Moriarty. I've had henchmen who, rather than try to one-up Doyle, I've had my villains in the employ of Moriarty, if you will.
Oh, okay.
Moriarty is a great character who isn't in all that many books. I think he's only referenced in like 4 short stories, 3 short stories and 1 novel. And, the biggest story that he plays a role in is The Final Problem, where Holmes goes to Switzerland and Moriarty follows him and they have that fight at the Reichenbach Falls. But, he's the number 1 villain in the canon, and I don't think, it's bad enough I'm stealing Doyle's detective, but I want to steal his villain too.
Now, didn't also Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to basically off Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, absolutely. He felt that his historical writings were being neglected because Holmes took so much attention from him. So despite, his mother got very angry at him. He told his mother he was going to kill his Holmes off.
And Mom didn't like it.
No, she was very upset. But he did it anyway. And then there was a situation where, as the years went by, publishers just kept coming back to him and basically throwing more money at it.
Speaking of that, Arthur Conan Doyle, that at the beginning, wasn't it that he wanted to kind of not do Sherlock Holmes? So when the publisher came, he said it's going to be a real high level of money, and they gave it to him.
Well, that's how Holmes got brought back. Holmes' origin traces to a dinner. He was at dinner, believe it or not, with Oscar Wilde. And I believe the publisher's name was George Nunez. And he commissioned Doyle and Wilde to write a story for him. And Wilde turned in a picture of Dorian Gray, and Doyle turned in a Study in Scarlet. And, from there he went to the short stories, because again, he was a struggling doctor. And, he didn't have a thriving practice by any means. So writing was a way to supplement the income. And then when Holmes took off, then he branched out into his other historical writing. And he wanted to do more of that, but all they wanted was Holmes. So he killed Holmes off, and they kept coming back and throwing more money and more money and more money. And then he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles, I believe. And what he did, he was smart, because he set that before Holmes perished. So this way he wasn't locked into, he hadn't actually brought him back. He brought him back to the public, but he hadn't brought him back to life yet. So that came back, and that was a success. And again, all that did was increase the demand for more Holmes stories. So then they came back and they threw 2 more, bathtubs full of money at him. And he said, okay, fine. And I believe that at one point he was the highest paid author in the world.
Did he know Bram Stoker?
I believe he did.
So how do you go about keeping it fresh, keeping ideas that are still they still resonate with the true Sherlock Holmes and story. But yeah, how do you keep it fresh?
I think what you have to do is look for something that has not been done before, at least not by Doyle. So as I mentioned, the Fabergé egg, which, you know how valuable they are and what collector's items they are, and that became the focal point. In the Poison Pawn, Holmes never once, to my knowledge, plays chess in the canon. He doesn't play in any of the novels or any of the short stories. And yet you would think someone like Holmes would be an excellent chess player, given the fact that he's always able to be 3 or 4 moves ahead of his opponent. And so that became almost a natural kind of motif for that particular story. And then Incidents, the second novel I wrote was The Stone of Destiny. And that involves the Coronation Stone, or the Stone of Scone. And it's about 360 pounds. And it sat in Westminster Abbey. It was in a chair called the Coronation Chair. And every king of queen of England would have to sit on this chair during the coronation. And then in I think it was 1950, a group of students broke into Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day and stole it. And eventually it was recovered. But for the longest time, Great Britain, that was their tradition. And it was a Final Jeopardy question one night, the Stone of Scone. And I remember thinking years later, wouldn't it be interesting? Because, they raised a large hue and cry when it was stolen. Everyone was out looking for it and everything else. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if this had been stolen years earlier, and for whatever reason, the Crown needed to keep it secret. They didn't want people to know that it had been stolen. So that's the way I structured that Holmes book.
Well, that's interesting. So you just kind of come across the idea and then you kind of think, well, that would be interesting.
Exactly.
But how much research, like when you're talking about something like that, or like chess playing and stuff, if you're not a chess player yourself, how do you make sure that it sounds like they're having an intelligent game, or do you kind of just avoid it?
No, as I say, I have researched things like how fast horses can gallop, how fast they canter. I have researched the ancient Irish alphabet system out of Ogham, Ogham. Anything that crosses my mind. The book before this was called Three May Keep a Secret. And I remember reading about this piece of jewelry that had been made using a technique I'd never heard of it before called plique-à-jour, which literally means let the daylight in. And that became the jumping off point for that book. There's a very valuable piece called the Merode Cup. And that deals with a lot of people forging antiquities and, selling them on the market as real pieces. So yeah, I would say if it takes me a year to write a book, 6 months is spent doing research and 6 months is spent in the actual writing.
So doing 14 of these, have you ever noticed maybe an accident that you assumed some of this kind of idea came from Arthur Conan Doyle, then you realize it was actually you from book 3 or something like this, that you're doing a pattern that you actually created as opposed to maybe Arthur Conan Doyle?
No, I can't say I'm that clever.
Oh, come on. Just say it.
I wish I could.
Yeah,
and it's not modesty preventing me, trust me.
So when you finish, how is this? When you finish a book,
right.
What does it do for you? Like, what do you get out of doing one of these books?
Well, when you're finished, the first thing you get is an immediate sense of relief. Okay? And then I have a series of beta readers, the toughest of which is my wife. But I give the book to, the various beta readers for feedback. And I've been very fortunate, very, very fortunate in that I know which books of mine are stronger. I know which books are the weaker ones. And knowing what you didn't do well in the past kind of helps you avoid that same pitfall in the future. The ability, you can know your strengths, but you also better know your weaknesses.
Right.
What exactly about it would make it strong, make it as opposed to weak? Like, what makes a good story or a good book?
Well, one of the things that too many books, not just Sherlock Holmes books, but too many books turn on is the idea of coincidence. And I try to avoid coincidence in any way, shape, or form in my books. It just, Romeo and Juliet just doesn't happen that often where, he misses the friar and the friar misses him and he goes into the tomb, stabs himself and she wakes up shortly after and stabs her. It doesn't work that way. Life doesn't turn on coincidence. Life turns on planning, and everything that Holmes does is meticulously planned. And that's the problem with my writing is that, we were talking about this before, plotters and pantsers. I'll be sitting at the computer and I'll be writing, and I always have this phrase, wouldn't it be cool if? And then I realize that I can make whatever I think would be cool happen. The problem is then it sometimes takes me 2 to 3 weeks to solve the problem I've just created for myself. Once you paint yourself into a corner, it can be difficult to get out.
Well, so what's your favorite one that you've written in the Sherlock Holmes series?
I'm kind of partial to, I'm partial to the Pawn. I'm partial to the Merchant of Venice. My wife's favorite, and it generally seems to be everybody else's favorite, is the Vatican cameos.
What do you think the difference is? Like, why do you see it different than what a lot of people do?
I think I've grown a little bit as a writer, and I don't think I'm making the same types of mistakes that I made in my earlier books, And I mean, there are things now, they're like the first 2 books I wrote, the point of view switched back and forth between Holmes and other characters. I don't do that anymore. The last 5, Watson has been the narrator and the only narrator. And, that's a struggle because you have to keep him in the book, and he has to be with Holmes, and yet Holmes has to be the focal point. So it's a little bit of a tougher writing process in that respect. But I think the rewards are worth it when you get done.
So we're not listening to Holmes at all. We're listening to Watson.
Well, you're listening to Holmes in dialogue, but Watson is the narrator.
Okay.
There's a lot of dialogue in the books.
Wow. I think it's fascinating putting something like this together. So how do you know when you've got the right story? That's a weird question, but in a sense of when you get an idea, like when you had something brewing in your mind or you hear something and you think about it and you want to apply it to Sherlock Holmes, what makes it right for you? What's the confidence thing?
Yeah, it has to. It's basically a feeling, I wish I could be more specific than that, but there are things that, you watch a movie or you read a book and, you say, yeah, that feels right. And I've had, false starts, and I've started with things that didn't work out the way I had hoped, or I've started with things and they've gone an entirely different way than I had imagined. And that's part of it. It's got to feel right, as nebulous as that sounds. That's really the answer.
Well, how about the very first book? To me, it's like you're putting so much on your shoulder to be the author of Sherlock Holmes himself. How did that happen?
How did that happen?
It's like, was it you that decided, or did someone ask you to do it, or?
No, I had decided, in the beauty of Doyle, and this goes back to an earlier question, is, throughout the canon, throughout his poems and his short stories and novels, he's always referencing other cases that we know nothing about. And that's where the Vatican cameos come from. That's a throwaway line at the beginning of The Hound of the Baskervilles. He Dr. Mortimer comes to, call on Holmes, and he says, you may have seen this. And Holmes says, no, he says, I was a little bit preoccupied taking care of that matter of the Vatican cameos for the Pope, so I missed several interesting English cases. And it's a throwaway line. But that throwaway line became, okay, what can I do with that title to turn it into a book?
Oh, wow.
And, some of the throwaway lines are fair, like the giant rat of Sumatra is a throwaway line, that Watson mentions. He said, the world is not ready yet for the tale of the giant rat of Sumatra. And bang, it's a tease. Now, whether Doyle ever intended to write these in the future or not, I don't know. But there are more than 100 untold tales in the canon. He mentions an amateur mendicant society. He mentions the mysterious case of the aluminum crutch, the lighthouse, the politician, and the trained cormorant. So all these things are out there. And some have been picked up and turned into pastiches by other authors. And I happen to choose the Vatican cameos for my first pastiche.
How is that? So do you get other authors fighting you over these?
No, Holmes today is almost, you had mentioned why he stays. It's almost like he's a cottage industry. There are probably, I would say, conservatively speaking, somewhere between 300 and 500 Holmes titles produced every year. Yeah. And that's not counting, that's just print. That's not counting fan fiction. That's not counting TV or movies or anything else. So, if you want to just up it to 500 and include everything, we can do that.
So are you ever going to change kind of the theme that you do? You kind of keep it back in the old times, like you have modernized yours. Or do you ever plan on doing something wild like that?
Well, I have a book in the back of my mind, and it's been in the back of my mind for probably 4 or 5 years now. And in college and in graduate school, I specialized in medieval literature. And, there's a lot of the medieval period that creeps into my books. And I have this one story from the Middle Ages that I would love to just sit down and turn it into a novel. Whether I will or not, that's another whole story. Because the great thing about Holmes is the world has been created. The characters are there, the setting is there, and the setting is, very rich. And all you really have to do as an author is, come up with a plot that works, as opposed to creating an entire world.
And I guess, in a way, both Holmes and Watson, their personalities can be changed.
Yes.
Like not the style of their detective and their behavior, maybe how they work on cases, but their actual attitudes and feelings and things like that can actually be changed from author to author.
Yes, absolutely. And again, Holmes, as created by Doyle, the later stories, he's a much more human, I don't want to say warmer, but that's the word. He's a warmer individual than he is in the earlier stories. Watson describes Holmes as an automaton, a thinking machine. And in the later stories, that's not nearly so evident.
So you could actually do, like just kind of like how they did it with females, Dr. Watson and stuff. You can,
sure.
Boy, the world is open.
Yeah, Holmes, Holmes has been everywhere. There was a cartoon series, Sherlock Holmes in the 23rd century. Holmes has, there's a book out, Sherlock Holmes and the Roswell incident. A lot of people, a lot of authors have taken him, into World War II, where, he'd kind of be in his 80s or 90s during the World War II. So that, that doesn't quite work. The World War I would be fine. He'd be near the end of his career, but, he'd be 60. So, okay. If he's a virile 60, that's fine.
One interesting thing that modern researchers have a better understanding of serial killers. Back when I researched the 19th century, that they really did not have a good grasp at all of how the serial killers thought. Do you ever kind of deal with that with Sherlock Holmes, or do you avoid any kind of serial killer?
No, I did my second book. The third book. The Druid of Death is a serial killer book.
Okay.
It's not random. So, I mean, these are very calculated, carefully planned, carefully orchestrated killings with a purpose in mind.
Okay.
It's not just, random like Jack the Ripper seems to have been.
Now, and in your murders and cases like that, you don't really get into the gore. Like in typical Sherlock Holmes fashion, it isn't like a descriptive murder, is it?
No, I don't. There are some authors that do, but I'm trying to be true to Doyle.
Yeah.
And give you what purports to be a Sherlock Holmes story, written by Dr. Watson. So I'm not going to deviate too far from, the written records that Watson has left us.
Do you guys have a group? Is there a Sherlock Holmes writers group? And do you guys do awards and magazines and all that stuff like Jack the Ripper, or do you guys know?
There are Sherlock Holmes societies all over the United States. Just about every major city has one, from Los Angeles to Washington to New York, and even a lot of smaller cities have them. But the biggest Sherlock Holmes society is the Baker Street Irregulars. And that's by invitation only. You have to be invited to join that. And in the history of the Baker Street Irregulars, Isaac Asimov was a Baker Street Irregular. Mickey Spillane was a Baker Street Irregular. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Baker Street Irregular. So they have this long, distinguished history going back, and they meet once a year in January in New York City to celebrate Sherlock Holmes' birthday, and they have a dinner. New members are invested. There's always a performance of some kind. It's an entire weekend every January dedicated to Sherlock Holmes, and people from all over the world fly in for this.
I realize it's a big festive. They've never invited me.
Well, that's what I was invited to.
I've only recently begun to get invited.
That's what I was invited to in Buffalo, because that's the Buffalo Society, the one in Buffalo with Kevin Gallivan. So, yeah, they're pretty dedicated.
Yeah, must be. Jeez.
Well, as I said, there was the one here in New York was called the Priory Scholars. I know the one in Texas is the Lone Bark. There's the Norwegian Explorers. They're all over. I mean, Minneapolis has a big one. Chicago has a big one. And they hold conferences. They hold symposiums every year.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. Now, for yourself here, do you like to interact with readers or fans and stuff like that? Do you have social media that you like to give out to people, or a website? How do people get a hold of Richard?
Well, the easiest thing, I have no problem interacting with readers. The easiest way to get hold of the books is Amazon. If you search Richard T. Ryan and add the word Holmes on Amazon, you'll come up with all the books. And then, I'm on Goodreads, so, people message me on Goodreads all the time. And, I have no problem interacting with readers at all. Enjoy hearing back from them.
So now I should also mention before we go that you you've done a book on Agatha Christie trivia. What drew you to that?
Well, again, I had it during the summers when I was a teenager. I had a job as a messenger in Manhattan. And a lot of my time was spent either sitting on a bench waiting to deliver something or riding the subways. And I loved mysteries. I would devour mysteries. And at that time, you could get a book for $1. And I would buy a book every morning for $1. And, I'd have it done by the time I got home, because I had to commute in from Staten Island to Manhattan and then back to Staten Island. So I became an avid reader. I had John Dixon Carr, Agatha Christie, people like that. I just read them constantly, which probably explains why I'm still fascinated by Holmes.
Ellery Queen?
Ellery Queen. Yeah, the golden age of mystery.
thing. I think it's much more interesting than modern day detective mysteries. But that's me. I don't know. Do you enjoy new stuff out there?
Well, I love the Jack Reacher character by Lee Child.
Yeah.
I think that's very, very well done. My other favorite authors include Stephen Hunter, Daniel Silva, and Kyle Mills, who writes the Mitch Rapp series. So those are people that I actually look forward to reading. Wait for their books every year.
Do you find a difference between British mystery detectives as opposed to American?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I ask quite often, and I get usually people that say, yeah, and they'll say their feeling on the two types of mystery writing. But I also get about 30% of writers that say, no, they're the same. So that always fascinates me. I wait for that answer where they say, no, I don't know. It's the same, and it's not, but that's okay. What's your take on the two? What's the big difference?
Well, I think, with the biggest difference is, I have this image in the back of my mind of you don't see the British detectives, going into any place guns blazing, whereas, American detectives, that seems to be one of their fortes. You think of something like Die Hard with John McClane, who's really a detective, right?
Yeah.
And then you compare it to something like the Helen Mirren series, Prime Suspect. And again, like John Luther, again, with Idris Elba, he's kind of a Sherlock Holmes character, and there's a difference in the way they approach their mysteries. There's a certain gentility to the British characters that Americans don't have.
There's also something I noticed. It's not as dramatic. Well, that's not the right word, but you could take a Sherlock Holmes. You'll learn what you need to about the characters, but it's not so drawn out. I find a lot of American mystery detective shows, especially, it gets it's too much drama in it. There's way too much stuff going on about the characters, like more than you need to know, and it almost takes away from the mystery.
Well, I think with American, it sounds almost like red herrings, and how do you handle red herrings? And if they're necessary, but you can overdo it. You can throw in all kinds of distractions, and those distractions can be character-based, they can be plot-based, they can be setting-based, whatever it may happen to be. But the British seem a little bit more straightforward in how they approach things than the Americans do. Much more linear, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
So would you mean something like one of the authors that I interviewed with Al talked about, usually his characters have some kind of flaw, and then he really works that flaw into that character?
Right.
You say something like that, where they go too far with the flaw or something?
They can, sure. You can carry anything too far. And, there are books that I've started, that I thought, come highly recommended, I just can't finish. And overwhelmingly, those books are written by American authors.
Yeah, there's too much sometimes. You get carried away with, it takes the focus away. It takes the tension away, the suspense away from the actual mystery. If there's too much fluff about the characters, especially the extra characters that really don't matter, but anyway, that's just,
Well, that goes back to one of the things I said earlier, with Doyle being this, the economical writer and doing in 2 sentences what other authors take 2 paragraphs, and maybe in some cases 2 pages to do.
Yeah, because there's always that. To me, that's what's an amazing writer or a great writer, is someone that, they can write a paragraph and you just look at it and you go, God, I wish I could write that. You know what I mean? Like,
I do.
captures
Believe
so
me, I
much
do.
in so little that you're like, wow, that's insane, and I want to do that.
Yeah.
And of course, I never do, but
Very few of us do.
but that's all right. That's all right. No, Michael Hawley does. He does.
Well, speaking of that, one of my
Okay.
fiction novels, I have my protagonist and the antagonist. They are in like a chess game, and my nephew, who's in his 40s, just loved it until at the end I blew everything up. So I went back to America and I blew it all up, and so he goes, I loved it. It was my favorite book until you blew everything up.
Yeah.
Oh well,
It was all good until then. Well,
that's right.
well, I really appreciate you coming on. It's been
I really appreciate you having me.
it's always fascinating talking to other authors and finding out stuff and kind of how they do things and get some good conversations. So, the newest book, of course, is called The Poisoned Pawn.
Right.
Sherlock Holmes Adventure, and the writer has been our guest. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
Richard T. Ryan.
Michael, it was a pleasure meeting you.
Oh, you as well. It was great.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?